Good morning, and thanks for joining today. It's a delight to see so many familiar names in the chat, as well as many new attendees. For those who don't know me, I'm Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Now, before we get moving with today's topic, I want you to be aware that I have several colleagues on the call who can answer your questions via the Questions tab, which you should see under or next to a hand-raising icon. So please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. They will answer your questions directly, and if those are appropriate for the entire group, they'll pass those along to me so I can address them to the larger group. I do also want to note that if you have to leave before you receive a response, our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. And one final note before we begin, you may already be aware, but we do have all of the past webinars recorded and available on our YouTube channel. If you go to video.servicetech.com, you'll see those there along with a handful of other videos on various topics. So this is a great resource. We'll kind of touch back on this a little bit later, but let's go ahead and jump into our topic for today, which is going to be a pretty broad subject. It's going to vary a lot or depend a lot on your organization's needs, and that is volunteer onboarding. Essentially, what does it look like for a volunteer to express interest in working with you to actually walking through the door? So for most organizations, this process can actually vary even within your own programming. You might have some opportunities that are open to any and all volunteers, and others that require a stringent set of trainings or checks to make sure that a volunteer meets your needs or is capable of the task at hand. Today, we're going to break down how to customize this process within CERVIS. But I want to quickly start off by addressing the standard flow for a volunteer to register for an opportunity in CERVIS, with of course the caveat that this process can be morphed quite a bit to fit your needs, and that's kind of what we'll be addressing throughout our time here today. So we're going to jump into kind of an example that I have established where I basically just have a landing page on our website that I might send volunteers to. And from here, I have buttons for existing volunteers, new volunteers, and new groups. This is not how you have to do this. This is just an example. A lot of organizations that we work with only have one button or maybe just a page where all of your events are being displayed. So I'm going to click into this existing volunteers just to show you this. This page is the event listing page, and you're probably familiar with this page. But from here, a volunteer can see the events that you've posted, and if they're interested in something, they can click to learn more about it. And from there, if they want to register for that opportunity, they basically just follow the prompts. They can register as a volunteer. If they're new to your system, they'll be asked to create a profile as a part of the registration process. If they're an existing user or if they've worked with you previously within the last 90 days, it'll just remember them and they'll just click to register and it'll kind of keep walking through that. If it's been a while since they've worked with you, or if they didn't know if they had a profile, or again, if they're a new volunteer, they're going to be brought to an account check page. And that's going to ask someone for their email address and first name. And that's basically just checking, hey, does this person already have an account? So they'll put their information in here. If that does match a profile, it'll just ask them for their password. And if they don't know that, they can reset it from that page. Otherwise, they can also just log in from here. So that's kind of the standard process for an existing user. Again, if it's a new user, if the system doesn't recognize them at all, it's going to ask them to fill out the application as a part of the registration process. So they'll fill out all the information that you're looking for, sign your terms down at the bottom, and create their profile as a part of the registration process. So once all of that's taken place, they will also just continue on and follow the prompts and finish out their registration. So there's nothing special a volunteer needs to know to use this. They don't need to log in first. They just see what you've posted and they kind of carry on through that registration process. Now, like I mentioned, that's kind of the standard workflow. There's a lot of ways to vary that or morph it depending on what your needs are. Like you might have a particular event where you want volunteers to apply and get added to a pending list as opposed to being directly registered. Or maybe you need to set certain restrictions in place because they have to have completed certain trainings or orientations, different things like that, or background checks. And then one other kind of quick variant I want to point out You can turn on something called QuickReg in Service, which basically truncates the registration process. I have that turned on for this event. You wouldn't know it by looking at it. You wouldn't know it by clicking into it. I know it because I created it. But when a volunteer goes to register for this opportunity, what they'll do is basically be presented with a field that's asking for name, phone, email. So this pop-up is going to kind of skip the rest of the registration process for the normal workflow. If someone puts their information in here and it matches an existing account, then it'll basically just complete the registration. If it doesn't match an existing account, it'll ask them to fill out the remainder of your QuickReg application, which we'll talk about how to customize that today. But that's basically a truncated version of your application page. But then this whole registration takes place within this menu. A volunteer's not logging in. Ultimately, if they want to register a family member for the same shift, they would just put that person's first name in instead of theirs, and then click to sign up. Okay, so again, that's kind of the standard workflow for volunteers who are signing up for events. I did just want to point out, normally once a volunteer registers for an event like this, once they kind of go through that process, then they're going to get a notification here that says they've been successfully registered. They'll get an email notification that says they've been signed up. But typically, once a volunteer does that, they're just going to close out of the browser and move on. They've kind of completed what they want to do with that interaction. Now, there are other things that volunteers can do. They could go and sign up for another event. They could sign up a family member for the same event. They could back out and go to their profile and edit their account, or view documents you've posted, or upload documents to their account, view what awards they've earned, run reports on their activity history. So there's different things volunteers can do. But like I said, typically if volunteers interacting in this kind of capacity, they're just signing up for the shift, closing out of the browser, and moving on. Okay, so again, that's kind of the standard workflow that a volunteer might take. Let's jump over to the admin side and talk about customizing some of that stuff that we've just looked at, and then some of the other actions associated with that onboarding process. So the first thing I want to walk through is customizing your application. And that's going to be done primarily in the system configuration under system management. So if we go into edit system configuration under the system management heading, there's two sections in here I want to point out: information collection and custom volunteer profile fields. Information collection contains kind of all of our default questions that you can just toggle on and off. There are some customization options in here as well in terms of modifying what these questions are actually asking. But for the most part, you're just going to be flipping these on or off. Now, I want to point out real quick, you won't see in here name, phone, email. Those are always required. So you won't see those as an option. You can't disable those. From the volunteer's perspective, name, phone number, and email address are always required fields. Okay, so that's kind of this section, information collection. This also contains all of your attributes, whether or not you want them on the application. Where you customize attributes is from the main dashboard. There's a whole heading, and I'm sure you've seen this before, but there's a heading called attribute management, and this would be where you would edit, for example, what skills you have that volunteers could select between, or what interest categories are in your system, or all of that. One last thing in the information collection section towards the bottom is your terms and conditions. So if you want volunteers to sign terms as a part of the registration process, this is where that's customized. So in here, you can kind of set up whether or not it's required and kind of how it's displayed to volunteers. I typically recommend setting this to yes, must accept inline. Personally, I just prefer the way that that's displayed. I'll show you that in a moment here. And then I also, if you're going to be working with minors, use the required type signature, include parent or guardian. That way, if someone's under 18, it automatically requires a parent or guardian to sign as well. So those are kind of the settings that I typically recommend. But then, of course, you can customize, well, what are the terms that the volunteer is agreeing to? Often this might be something like a liability waiver or hold harmless agreement or a photo release or a volunteer code of conduct. It's obviously entirely up to you and your legal what you might include in here. But let me show you what this looks like from the volunteer's perspective when they're agreeing to this, and then also what happens once they have agreed to it. So I'm going to switch over using the console navigation tab at the top here to the volunteer application. Now this is going to log me out. So a lot of times I like to open up an incognito browser to go to a page like that, but we'll just go ahead and do that. This will take us to the application page. And if we scroll down to the bottom, you'll see here we have the terms and conditions. So this is how it's displayed to volunteers. They have to check this box before they can create a profile. They have to type in their signature. And if they're under 18, it would also require a parent or guardian signature. So again, this is that inline display method that I personally prefer. If you don't like this, there's also an option to have it kind of hidden behind a click here to view button. But once someone agrees to these terms or signs these terms, then on the admin side, you can see that reflected in volunteer profiles. So we're going to log back in here. And if we go into the volunteer database, and we'll just use an example volunteer. If we click to view profile details for a volunteer, and we scroll down, you can see about halfway through, it tells us their accepted terms and conditions date. And this will actually store up to 10 dates. Each of those is clickable, so you can actually download a copy of those terms when that person agreed to them. So if you click on this, it'll basically just prompt a PDF download, and this PDF will use whatever header image you have set up for your account. And then below that, it has the volunteer's contact information. Again, this is just a fictitious volunteer. And then below that, it has all of the terms and conditions. So when did you post the terms? So when did you actually last edit them before they signed them? And then what do those terms actually say when they signed them? And then below that, it has their signature information as well. So like I said, that can actually be reproduced for the last 10 instances that someone signed those terms. So if you want to have people re-sign those year over year, you can do so. Okay, so that's terms and conditions. That's obviously a part of the application when a volunteer is creating a profile or updating their account. And that's kind of the last part of this information collection section. But I do also want to point out the other section in here in the system configuration, your custom volunteer profile fields. If you have other more specific questions that are maybe more unique to your organization, this would be where you would put those questions. So if you want to ask someone if they want to receive your newsletter, or what the name of their employer is, or if they have any medical conditions you should be aware of, or if they can lift more than 25 pounds, those kinds of questions are what you would put into here. I have a couple examples in my demonstration console, but these are another layer of information that's on the application. Now, before we move on from customizing the application, there's kind of two more quick things I want to point out. One is that you can reorder the questions on your application. So if maybe you created a couple custom questions that are sort of related to one another, if you go to the top of the information collection section, you can click on Reorder Volunteer Profile Fields. This button also says Configure QuickReg, so we'll talk about that in here too. But in this menu, you can drag and drop the questions on your application to change their order. So you'll notice by default, Service puts last name at the top and then first name below that. If you don't like that, you can drag and drop those to switch them. Other than that, of course, you can move around like custom fields or anything else you'd like to. Now, every possible question on your application is presented here. So anything that says unused custom field or disabled, you can just ignore those. They're not currently in use. They're not going to show up anywhere. And then I also want to point out on the right-hand side, there's this checkbox, and this is whether or not this question is a part of the QuickReg application. So we did briefly touch on that at the beginning today. That's like that truncated registration process. By default, name, phone, email are already selected, and you can't deselect those. Again, that's the minimum for a volunteer to create a profile. But in my system, I also have birth date checked, and then I also have the terms and conditions checked. So when someone creates a profile using QuickReg, those two things are also requested. Okay, and then one more aspect to data collection. We're not going to dig too deeply into this, but I want to point out there's a whole other host of questions that you can ask called custom registration questions. These would be questions that you establish, so there are no defaults in here. If you go into Manage Custom Registration Questions, you can establish whatever you'd like to through here. Of course, this is my demonstration console, so I have some existing examples. But basically, these are questions that are only presented on particular events where you have enabled them. So if you have a specific event, maybe you're recruiting for an internship or accepting applications for a particular post, you might have certain questions that relate to that particular opportunity. that you don't need most of your volunteers to answer. And that's what custom registration questions are used for. You can use them to collect extra information as someone is signing up for or applying for a particular opportunity in your system. So this is just where you generate these questions. Where you actually employ the questions is in the opportunity management side of the database. If you go into search and manage existing opportunities, in here, every event or every opportunity has this option to manage custom registration questions. And if you click into that, you can say, for this event, I want to know if volunteers can speak Spanish. And I also want to know the name of their current employer, but I want to change that order. So you can change on every single event which questions are in use, whether or not they're in use, and then also the order they're presented to volunteers. Okay, so that's kind of the data collection aspect of the volunteer onboarding process. Now, we didn't walk through creating all the different attributes. We have different videos on that process as well. But if you need to customize like what skills you're requesting and what interest categories, that's all done under attribute management. But that's kind of the data collection portion of a volunteer creating a profile initially. So let's talk about what happens next. Once a volunteer creates an account, there is an automated notification that goes to that volunteer by default. In the system configuration, under system management, there's a section called email message content. And in here, if we scroll down a bit, there's a message that's called profile creation confirmation message. And it's exactly what it sounds like. When a volunteer creates an account, they get this email automatically if this is set to yes. So by default in new accounts, this is set to yes. So that should be enabled normally. If that's not enabled, obviously you can modify that and you can change what data is being sent to the volunteer. Now there's a couple things I want to point out. One is that you can employ some variables in here. You don't need to memorize these or scribble these down. They're written in the information box next to this field. That's true of any variable in Service. It'll always be listed in the field next to where it's applicable. So if you don't see an information box next to a field, you shouldn't try to employ that variable. If you don't see a variable in the information box, you shouldn't try to use it in that particular field. So again, for this email, this is just going to volunteers as soon as they create a profile. It's relatively bare bones by default, so I'd usually customize that to include some branding information. But this is just going to say, hey, volunteer, thanks for creating a profile. Here's your temporary password. Now, there is another use case that I want to point out. If you, in this drop-down menu, see an option to edit an activation email instead, that just means that you're asking volunteers to create a password when they initially create their profile as a part of the registration process. And so that's kind of like a different way to engage volunteers and have them create their password right away. That is a setting in the system configuration as well. Under security and privacy settings, you have the option of asking volunteers if you want them to create their profile initially. This is set to no normally for most accounts. If you change this to yes, then volunteers are just creating their password as soon as they create their account. And so they're getting an activation email. So that's a different email. It's basically just, I'm sure you've all seen an email like this where it just says, thanks for creating a profile, click here to confirm. We're basically just confirming that that volunteer has access and owns that email address. So that's a notification to volunteers when they create a profile. But of course, you as an admin can also be notified when a volunteer creates an account. And there's a couple ways that that can take place. One of those is under the system settings in the system configuration. There's a notification in here called auto assign follow-up for new volunteers. You can have this occur for all volunteers who create a profile, including QuickReg, or you can exclude QuickReg. Maybe you're only using that in certain circumstances where you don't care to follow up with those volunteers. But yeah, you can turn on this notification, assign who it's set to, and then if you'd like to, you can also receive an email notification on top of this. So this follow-up is a notification within Service. So if this is enabled in your console, from the main dashboard, under Volunteer Management, you'll see View Manage Volunteer Follow-up. And this will be present whether or not that setting is enabled. But if that setting is enabled, then in here, you will see follow-ups for new volunteers. When someone creates a new account, it's going to generate a notification for you to follow up with that person. What this menu is basically a task manager. It lets you keep track of ongoing tasks that you might have in terms of engaging with specific volunteers. You can create your own follow-ups through here manually. At the top under standard options, click on add new follow-up. And then in here, you could say, okay, someone needs to follow up with Greg. I could assign this to myself or to some other admin, and maybe we need to conduct an interview. So I could create a follow-up like this. And once this is added into the system, then whomever that's assigned to will see a notification on the main dashboard when they're logged in. So if we back up to the main dashboard now, you can see that that icon is flashing. So we can use these internally and just manually create follow-ups if you want to keep track of someone needing to call so-and-so or take care of certain tasks or whatever it is. And then you can also edit these as you're kind of engaging with that data. So maybe I called and left a voicemail. I could go in here and add like the date if I wanted to and say I left a voicemail, and then just save that as a part of the follow-up itself until I actually have time to go in and kind of clean it up or take care of it. All of this data is only visible on the back end. Volunteers cannot see this information. And once you do close this out, so maybe I completed the interview and I wanted to add some more information in here or whatever, as soon as I've done that, I can complete the action. All of that data will get added as a note to that volunteer's profile. So again, this is basically just a menu where you can take care of or keep track of tasks. If you turn on that notification for new volunteers, these will be generated automatically. So you'll get a new follow-up every time a new volunteer creates an account. You'll notice from this menu, you can reassign follow-ups if you want to. So if you want to give it to some other staff member, you could do that. You can also click to view someone's profile details through here. So if you just want to quickly view someone's account information without backing out to the volunteer side of the database, this will give you a pop-up with that person's info. You can also email people directly through here. And then some of those actions can be done in bulk as well. So I could select multiple of these, complete multiple of them at one time, or reassign them, send an email to all these people, or manage their profiles if I want to do some bulk actions like updating checklist items or running background checks, things like that. Okay, one other note kind of along these lines, as a part of following up with volunteers, you might be, sending them emails and engaging with their profile that way. If you send an email to a volunteer, that will show up in their profile. If you click on View Profile Details, you scroll about halfway through, right where the terms and conditions were, you'll see notes on their account, and then below that, their email message history. So anytime you've manually emailed someone through CERVIS, that'll get stored in their profile. You can see when it was sent, the subject, and if you click on this view message, you can actually see the full content of the email, who sent it, who else received it. So this is pretty helpful for keeping on top of, whether or not certain messages were sent. I do want to point out you won't see automated messages in here. So like that new profile confirmation email or a registration confirmation email, you're not going to see those show up in here. Only messages that are sent manually. Okay, so that's kind of the notification side of a volunteer creating a new account. There are a couple other notifications I just want to briefly mention. You can be notified by volunteers self-selecting interest categories. So in your system, when you create an interest category, you define who a contact person is. So let's say your organization is pretty disparate or distinct in terms of who's in charge of what portion. If you list each person in charge of their different categories in here, you can turn on a notification that correlates to this. And that's going to be in the same place in the system configuration, system settings as that other notification we looked at. Just at the bottom here, we have this interest category contact person notification method. This can either assign a follow-up or send an email. But basically when a volunteer is editing their profile, whether they're making a new account or editing an existing profile, if they go in and select a particular category, then it would send a notification to the person who is the point of contact for that category. So that's another form of notification. And then one other is just being notified of registrations instead. Maybe you don't care to know every time a new volunteer creates a profile, but rather you want to know when they sign up for this event or apply for that opportunity. That's going to be done on an opportunity by opportunity basis. So if we go into add an opportunity or edit an existing one, under the additional organizer options, you can turn on those notifications through here. and that's going to be sent to obviously the organizers of this opportunity. Okay, there's a few more topics I want to cover briefly here in terms of volunteer onboarding. So there's a couple other tasks related to engaging with new volunteer accounts. For example, you might have some documentation that you either want to upload to a volunteer's profile or have them upload themselves. Maybe you want them to add their own resume or some kind of scan of a document or some form or something else. So if you want to, you can allow volunteers to add attachments to their own profile. This is a setting in the system configuration under security and privacy. In here, you'll see the option to allow file attachment uploads. You can set this to yes or yes admin only, which means only administrators can see these volunteer uploaded documents. They're set to private by default. You can also be notified of uploaded documents if you want to. You can add one person's name in here, and then whenever someone uploads a document, that person will get an email notifying that there's a new attachment. You can also search by accounts that have attachments that were added recently. So you don't necessarily need to be notified of this. If you go into the advanced volunteer search, at the bottom of this page, there's an option to search by file attachments. And you can search in here for people who either have or don't have a file attachment. But more importantly, you can also search for file attachments that were uploaded between certain dates. So if you want to see all the accounts that had something uploaded since the start of the month, you could go and run a search for that, and that'll show you all those profiles. Now, from the volunteer's perspective, a volunteer could upload attachments, again, if you allow that. So I'm going to switch over to the volunteer view. And in here, we can see under profile management, there's an option to upload file attachments. So if you wanted them to add a scan of something or a particular document to their profile, they can go into upload file attachments. From here, choose a file from their computer and then upload that to their account. That would just look like this. Once they've uploaded it, they don't really have control over it anymore. It's just been added to your end. So from your perspective, when you are looking at a volunteer who has uploaded a document, you'll see that paperclip icon to indicate there is an attachment. And if we click into this, you'll be able to see all the documents on this person's profile. You can also get to the same menu even if they don't have attachments, right? So I use the shortcut here, but if we look at, my entire volunteer database, not everyone has that shortcut because not everyone has an attachment on their profile already. But if you go into manage a profile on the left-hand side, sort of the main menu, you'll see that same paperclip icon in here. You can view or update file attachments through here, and this allows you to add attachments as well. So it's same thing. You can choose files and add those to a volunteer's account. And then below that, you'll see all the files on this person's profile. If someone uploaded a document themselves, it'll have this warning icon saying, hey, this was a volunteer who did this. This was not you. So that's just to make you aware of that before you download it, just to be cautious. There are two other icons here. You can post a document and you can also restrict a document. I kind of mentioned this earlier. If you restrict a document, it's only accessible to administrators. So you can even set up, again, volunteers to only upload to admin directly, and that would just kind of be ticked automatically. So this means that your other staff, leadership team, group leaders, they can't see this document. Posting a document lets you send a document basically to the volunteer side. If you post a document, then it becomes accessible to any person to whom that's relevant. In this case, this is directly on a volunteer's profile. So now when that volunteer logs in, they can go in and view posted documents. And so they might be able to go and download a form that they're supposed to fill out and then re-upload it through their profile. Okay, and then also just briefly, and I'm sure you kind of noticed this or maybe even assumed, but when you are looking at a volunteer's profile, looking at those attachments, of course you can go in here and open those to download them or remove them if you need to. So that's kind of engaging with documentation. And then a couple other things. Of course, I mentioned at the start, you might have some restrictions in place for your events based on whether or not someone's done a certain training or completed an orientation, or maybe you've run a background check or a police check on them. In those cases, you need a place to store that information. So in CERVIS, there is a default background check field that's enabled in the system configuration. under information collection, you can tell the system that you do want to track background checks. This doesn't mean that volunteers can engage this data. It's only visible on the back end. This means there's a place for you to record this information. Now in CERVIS, you can also run background checks through Backgrounds Online. We have an integration with them directly. That's set up in the system configuration under background check integration. But when that's established under the volunteer management heading, you can essentially order background checks. You can go into view and manage background checks. From here, you can search for an individual. You can select which background check you want to run on this person, click on submit, and then that will send that volunteer an email to get the background check started. Again, Backgrounds Online is the one running the background check. You can set up customized background checks through them, but basically they have different sort of packages by default that you can run, and you can also do customized ones. So once the volunteer receives that email, they can go and fill it out. It'll be pending applicant until they've filled it out. Then it'll be in progress. And then once that's been completed by Backgrounds Online, it'll be marked as either review or clear, which means you have the ability with both of these to download the document, review it yourself, and then decide if you want to pass or fail this person. So again, this is using the Backgrounds Online integration. We have more information on that integration and how that all functions. We've done a webinar on that topic specifically. But I also want to mention that you can also just record the results of background checks if you already have like a city vendor or something that you have to use. You can go into a volunteer's profile, an existing volunteer or a new volunteer, and just indicate the background check status, so whether or not it was completed, what the results were, and then also when it was completed. And then both of those pieces of info, of course, are searchable, and you can also use those to set restrictions on events, which is kind of what we're talking about in this case. And then there's one other aspect to that I want to talk about, and that's checklist items. So just briefly, checklist items are another way to keep track of, again, basically tasks that you want to keep track of on behalf of volunteers. Usually I do this in the context of dated tasks. So like, when did someone complete a certain training, or when did they complete their TB test, or whatever it is. So you can create all sorts of checklist items through here for different trainings or orientations or tests or checks or whatever that volunteers need to do or complete, or just a part of the process of onboarding volunteers. You can make checks for all of those. And then on each volunteer's profile, so if we go back into the volunteer database here, we'll be able to see an icon next to each person's account for managing checklists. And if we click into that, we can see for this person, where are they at? So where do they stand with these different checklist items? Is anything overdue? Has it been completed? Has it not been assigned? And then of course you can edit these through here as well. So maybe this person just completed their TB test. I could go in here and mark the date that they completed it. I could even backlog it if I needed to. And then you can add expiration dates too. Maybe this is the one that's good for 5 years, right? So I can go and add that in there and even add some more notes about it if I want to have some more information there. Okay, so checklist items and background checks are both a part of how you can set restrictions on events, along with things like what age a volunteer is or other custom fields you might have. So let's just briefly look at that, because this is also sort of part of setting up your system to receive volunteers. When you create an opportunity, there's a section for registration restrictions. And in here, you can tell the system who is allowed to register. And that is how you should think about this. The way restrictions work in services, you're selecting who's permitted to register, not who's prevented from registering. So if I only want volunteers who are over 18, who've passed a background check, who've completed my training, those are the things that I would select. I'm choosing who I want to be allowed to register, not who I'm preventing from registering. I do want to note, if you're using checklist items as an example for restrictions, and you need to have multiple things that are prohibitive, they have to have all of these things done. There's a setting here that says require any or all of the selected items, and you can toggle that over to all. So then a volunteer could only register if all 3 of these things are marked as completed on their profile. And then one last note too about restrictions, you can set a failure message. to basically inform volunteers what the requirements are, why they might not have met them. Service won't automatically tell someone that they don't, what the requirements are that they didn't meet, because it could be personal information. The exception to that is gender and birth date. So if you have like an age restriction, it will tell them that they're too young, if you have like an 18 and up, some kind of thing. But if you want to give someone like next steps, I almost always recommend editing this, because then you can give someone instructions on what they need to do to continue working with you. They've just expressed interest in this event. So instead of just saying, sorry, you can't do this, you could tell them, well, this is what you need to do if you want to do this. So that's kind of what I would put in this message. Okay. So we went through a lot of data today. There's a couple topics that we kind of lightly touched on, like sending emails and running background checks and different kind of features like that we have done webinars on specifically. So if you're kind of interested in learning more about one of those more specific topics, again, I want to direct you to the video.servicetech.com. That'll just take you to our YouTube channel. You could also just go to YouTube and search for Service Technologies. But all of our posted or recorded webinars are posted up here. So you can go back through and look over those. Again, we've gone over a lot of the topics in more detail on what we kind of glanced over today, just as they touch on sort of the volunteer onboarding process. So I'd encourage you to utilize this resource. This is an excellent tool as you are working in the system. There's a lot of good information posted here. But of course, I also want to point out our customer support team. I know that there's been a lot of questions throughout the call here. Most of them were pretty specific, so we're not going to address any of those to the larger group. If you have continued questions about this topic or really anything else within the system, obviously I'd encourage you to engage with our customer support team. You can even ask if you have any training time on your account or how you could get more training time if you want some more one-on-one time. I just want to mention that what we've covered today is a very brief, truncated version of what we might go through with a new customer that typically takes around 2 hours. So there's a lot of data that we kind of tried to pack in here that obviously you have some more specifics in your organization. You might have some more specific questions and want to walk through this together. We're happy to do that with you. So if you have questions, click on the Need Help button. When you're logged in, you can type in a question through here. Let's say you want to learn more about reporting. There's a lot of good articles in here, but you can also click on Contact Us and then submit a ticket through there. All right, and that will bring us to the end of our time here today. I want to thank you again for joining us. It is always a pleasure to speak with you all. I look forward to our next meeting, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.